Commencing debate, a second reading motion of the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty Act, standing in the name of the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations.
Ms. Alty, seconded by Mr. Long, moves the Bill C-21, an act to give effect to the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty and to make consequential amendments to other acts, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Debate the Honourable Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that Canada's Parliament is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. Mr. Speaker, I rise today grateful for the opportunity to speak to this bill, a bill that will bring into force the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty. Ce traité sur l'autonomie gouvernementale est une étape historique. Il favorise la réconciliation, reconnaît le droit des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge à s'organiser et à se gouverner et officialise notre relation de gouvernement à gouvernement avec la Fédération Métis du Manitoba dans le droit canadien. With this legislation, we honor the legacy, the rights, and the future of the Red River Métis, and we reaffirm their rightful place in the social, legal, and legislative fabric of Canada. This self-government treaty is the result of working closely with the Manitoba Métis Federation President, David Chartrand, his cabinet, and their team on a co-developed process, shaped through the recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination table. I wish to applaud President Chartrand and the MMF for their work to bring us to this day. Le chemin qui a mené vers ce traité sur l'autonomie gouvernementale avec les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge a commencé il y a plus de 150 années. Au fil des générations, les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge se font forger une identité distincte en tant que peuple doté d'une culture, d'une langue et d'un patrimoine riche et profond. Ils ont tracé leur propre voie en ce gouvernement selon leur vision, leurs valeurs et leurs priorités distinctes. In the late 1800s, the Red River Métis formed their own provisional government of Assiniboia during the Red River Resistance. This government, led by Louis Riel, was formed to give voice to the Red River Métis. The Red River Métis colony was where Manitoba sits today. In 1869, the Red River Métis provisional government began negotiations with the Crown about joining the country as its fifth province. These negotiations led to the Manitoba Act 1870 and included promises to the Red River Métis. The province of Manitoba was born. The promises never materialized. The Red River Métis have had to undertake, often collectively, numerous court challenges to win Canada's recognition of rights they had exercised as a people for generations and which they were trying to negotiate into the law of the land in 1869 through 1870. These court challenges and the Constitution Act of 1982 set the stage for this, the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty. It is in the Constitution Act of 1982 where Métis are legally recognized. Section 35 identifies three distinct Indigenous groups: First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. It also affirms that all three hold Aboriginal and treaty rights. Despite the promise of Section 35, it still took subsequent court challenges to establish precedents upholding Indigenous rights. The Supreme Court of Canada's 2013 decision in Manitoba Métis Federation Incorporated versus Canada was one of the catalysts for a series of negotiations and agreements with the MMF, which led to the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty, and the proposed implementing legislation that is being debated today. While today's moment is what Louis Riel and his government sought more than 150 years ago, the text, spirit, and meaning of this landmark self-government treaty was developed in full partnership with the Manitoba Métis Federation over the last 7 years. The bill before us today is a co-developed living document setting out rules, regulations, and processes for self-governance crafted by the Red River Métis on their terms and agreed to by Canada, not imposed by the Crown. The treaty recognizes the Red River Métis' right to self-government and the MMF's role as their government. It formally recognizes the MMF's jurisdiction over citizenship, leadership selection, and government operations. This includes determining how their government is structured and operated, how they manage their finances, how they are accountable to their citizens, and how they administer and enforce their governance laws. Significantly, it will be the first self-government treaty achieved with a Métis government in Canada. This self-government treaty was developed in full partnership with the MMF and is the result of the negotiations that began in 2016. The MMF and Canada signed a framework agreement for advancing reconciliation that year, setting the stage for formal negotiations. Early in these negotiations, the MMF identified self-governance as a priority. The Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty delivers on a key commitment made in an earlier recognition agreement signed by the parties in 2021. The treaty has the same focus on internal governance, and it affirms and builds on the recognition of the MMF as an Indigenous government in the 2021 agreement. But the treaty includes more details on key issues such as implementation, harmonizing laws, and dispute resolution. The Self-Government Treaty was approved by Red River Métis citizens in June of 2023, and it was also shaped by over a year of engagement with other Indigenous groups, including First Nations in Manitoba and other Métis governments. On November 30th, 2024, the Government of Canada and the MMF signed the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty at a historic ceremony held in Winnipeg. The treaty needs federal legislation to make it legally binding and bring it into force. At that time, it will replace the 2021 agreement. Passage of this bill by Parliament is this final step in the process. The treaty also sets out a process for negotiating other self-government arrangements with MMF in the future. The potential topics for such future negotiations are listed in the treaty. This includes, for example, education, economic development, language, heritage, and culture. If any additional jurisdictions, i.e. law-making powers, are negotiated with the Manitoba Métis Federation in the future, Crown consultations will take place at that time with other Indigenous groups on matters that may affect them. These consultations will take place in keeping with the Crown's duty to consult before any such future self-government arrangements with the Manitoba Métis Federation can be finalized. I have mentioned that early on in our negotiations toward the 2016 Framework Agreement, the MMF identified self-government as a priority. Self-governance empowers Indigenous peoples to deliver programs and services in ways that reflect their traditions, priorities, and goals of their people by their people. This is what the Louis Riel-led Provisional Government of Assiniboia sought in 1869. Les ententes sur l'autonomie gouvernementale contribuent également à créer la stabilité qui ouvre la voie à de nouveaux investissements, à la croissance économique et à de meilleurs résultats sociaux dans les communautés. Les communautés ayant conclu des ententes sur l'autonomie gouvernementale obtiennent souvent de meilleurs résultats en matière d'éducation, de possibilités d'emploi et de revenus pour leurs membres. Les ententes sur l'autonomie gouvernementale reconnaissent et soutiennent les droits ancestraux, notamment le droit à l'autonomie gouvernementale et le droit à l'autodétermination. Le droit à l'autodétermination est reconnu dans la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. À l'article 4 de la Déclaration des Nations Unies, il est indiqué que les peuples autochtones, dans l'exercice de leur droit à l'autodétermination, ont le droit d'être autonomes et de s'administrer eux-mêmes pour tout ce qui touche à leurs affaires intérieures et locaux. Les ententes sur l'autonomie gouvernementale sont négociées en fonction des besoins et des aspirations uniques des différents peuples et communautés. Nous poursuivons poursuivons aussi l'élaboration conjointe d'ententes sur l'autonomie gouvernementale et d'autres ententes fondées sur les droits avec des partenaires autochtones dans le cadre de tables de discussion réparties dans tout le pays, représentant plus de 500 communautés autochtones, soit une population totale d'environ 1 million de personnes. Nous apprécions profondément nos relations avec tous les partenaires autochtones et nous nous réjouissons de poursuivre ces conversations dans un véritable esprit de réconciliation, de prospérité partagée et de partenariat. Le Canada est une nation fondée sur de nombreux traités, et ceux-ci sont des engagements durables qui façonnent les relations, habilitent les communautés et créent des possibilités pour les générations à venir. The Self-Government Treaty with MMF would come into force once the implementing legislation is passed. Doing so would affirm the inherent rights of the Red River Métis, and it would also mark a critical step forward in Canada's ongoing journey of reconciliation and nation building. Passing this legislation would continue to strengthen our relationship with the Manitoba Métis Federation and position them as full partners in building Canada's future. The Red River Métis have always been nation builders, from the fur trade to the founding of Manitoba, and now through major projects in energy, housing, and environmental stewardship. Mr. Speaker, by passing this bill, we fulfill a promise carried forward by generations of Métis leaders. We affirm rights, unlock potential, and empower the Red River Métis to continue shaping Canada's future as equal partners. This treaty is a foundation for long-term success. It affirms the rights of the Red River Métis to lead in shaping their communities. Our modern-day treaty on governance with the MMF is a commitment to partnership, progress, and shared prosperity. By supporting Métis self-governance, we are investing in a future where Indigenous communities lead the way in building a stronger, more resilient Canada. Mr. Speaker, as our overall talks with the MMF continue and our joint work advances, the rights and interests of other Indigenous peoples, third parties, and all Canadians will be respected during the negotiation of any shared solution, agreement, or approach to reconciliation. Canada and the MMF have developed an implementation plan that sets out what actions each must take to deliver on their commitments in the Self-Government Treaty and put it into action. This plan will help smooth the transition to self-government based upon the terms and conditions of the treaty. An Intergovernmental Relations Committee will also be created to provide a forum for the parties to jointly oversee the successful implementation of the treaty. This treaty is a turning point in our shared history. It helps address a historic wrong and sets the foundation for a renewed, respectful, and enduring government-to-government relationship. When passed, this legislation will mark an historic milestone. The treaty is set to take effect on the day of royal assent, a moment that will formally recognize, at long last, the Red River Métis right to self-government in Canadian law and formally affirm the MMF as their government. Mr. Speaker, this treaty is the result of years of aspiration, dialogue, negotiation, and consultation. It began more than a century and a half ago and came together when thousands of Red River Métis citizens overwhelmingly approved the draft treaty in 2023. Let us finally act on their voices. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci beaucoup and merci.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. Now, member for Edmonton West.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her well thought out and respectful speech. We don't often see it as much in this House as we need to, and as the province or the taxpayers deserve. I have a question. I'll be honest, I don't know as much about this file as perhaps others, but I have a question that's been brought forward to me. And in the Powley decision, the courts emphasized that the Métis communities are diverse with distinct histories and traditions across different regions. This treaty may risk such that diversity pushing it into a single narrative, and that elevates the Red River Métis above other authorities. I wonder if perhaps the minister can explain why how this bill is exclusionary or promotes inclusion as opposed to exclusion.
The Honourable Minister for Crown-Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate my colleague's question. It is important that the Métis self-government agreements represent the Métis communities. So today the item before the House is the Manitoba Métis Federation self-government agreement. The Government of Canada is also negotiating agreements with other Métis governments across Canada. Once those agreements are concluded, we will bring those to the House. But the importance of today's legislation is about the representation and the self-governance of the Red River Métis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, le député de la Pointe-de-l'Île.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Bloc québécois est favorable au projet de loi. On pense que c'est une façon de corriger une injustice là, qui est là depuis 150 ans, depuis la promesse de traité à Louis Riel et son gouvernement provisoire. Ma question, c'est un petit peu semblable à celle de mon collègue. Comme là, l'Union, le traité est avec le MMF. S'il y a d'autres groupements métis, comme, je ne sais pas, l'Union métis Saint-Joseph du Manitoba ou, je ne suis pas un spécialiste, là, à ce moment-là, est-ce qu'il va y avoir d'autres traités avec, à moins qu'ils veulent faire partie, ils veulent peut-être aussi faire partie du MMF, là, mais est-ce qu'il y a un mécanisme pour s'assurer de pouvoir couvrir l'ensemble des métis des différents regroupements?
L'Honorable Ministre.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et j'apprécie aussi mon question. Oui, celui-ci, c'est à propos de la Red River Métis, le Manitoba Métis Federation, mais on négocie aussi des traités avec des autres gouvernements Métis autour du Canada, incluant Alberta, Saskatchewan, ceci c'est à propos de Manitoba, mais aussi Ontario, et aussi avec des Métis au territoire du Nord-Ouest. Donc, oui, on s'engage à des autres traités avec des autres gouvernements Métis qui représentent des autres Métis autour du Canada. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Questions, comments, the member for Winnipeg South Centre.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to take the opportunity to provide some brief commentary. I remember being a grade 6 French immersion student and winning a ticket to go to the Festival du Voyageur, which for all from Manitoba will know is a marquee event that helps us to understand our history. And of course, it is the deeply embedded culture of the Manitoba Métis people, the Red River Métis, that are on full display during that time of year. And hypothetically, Mr. Speaker, if President Chartrand were here with us today, hypothetically, of course, because I'm not allowed to draw the attention of people in the gallery to the House, I would tell him and those with him that we are incredibly proud to have worked alongside their government, their people, to enrich the fabric of our city, of our province, of our country. And Louis Riel, Mr. Speaker, Manitoba's first premier, is no doubt smiling down on this House today, a House that he had to sneak into after being a duly elected member so many years ago to fight for the rights that we are recognizing in this chamber today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to appreciate my colleagues' comments. And I did just want to elaborate on two questions that were asked before. This treaty includes robust, non-derogation language, setting out that nothing in the treaty affects, recognizes, or provides any rights affirmed by Section 35 of any Indigenous community, collectivity, or people other than the Red River Métis. The other thing I think that's important is to note individuals have a choice as to which Métis government represents them. So to become a Red River Métis citizen, an individual must apply. The treaty establishes that those who self-identify as Red River Métis, they have to show a demonstrable connection to the historic Red River Métis community, and they also have to be accepted by the contemporary Red River Métis community. And so it is important with this treaty that it is also about membership and selection of leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Comments, the member for Edmonton North West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for her speech today and bringing this forward. Certainly, we see self-determination on behalf of any Indigenous community and Métis community included as being a good thing. She ended off her last comments about talking about registration and identifying as a part of that community and that nation. But this Liberal government has actually taken a different approach when it came to consultation on Bill S2, which ultimately defined who First Nations people are as a part of the Status Indian Act. And there they've undertaken significant consultations and delayed that bill. On this one, I've heard from First Nations that they've done zero consultation or very minimal consultation on this. I'm wondering if the Minister could explain the level of consultation taken on this with First Nations versus S2.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my colleague's question. So Canada is committed to ensuring that the duty to consult is met and, where appropriate, that accommodation is made for any Indigenous group whose rights may be adversely impacted. On August 24th, 2023, Canada initiated a consultation and a strategic engagement process on the treaty with recognized Métis governments and those who assert Section 35 Métis rights that could potentially be impacted by the treaty, as well as broader strategic engagement with all First Nations in Manitoba and the Government of Manitoba. Correspondence and meetings took place between Canada and consultees between August 2023 and October 2024. The consultation process ended on October 9th, 2024. And again, Mr. Speaker, I did just want to take a note again that this legislation is about the self-governance of the Métis, and therefore it doesn't touch on land or resources or harvesting rights. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I have noticed both members for Winnipeg Centre and Winnipeg South are asking questions. I'll try to get them both in. A member for Winnipeg Centre.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister just indicated that the treaty formally recognizes Métis self-determination in Canadian law, but it's my understanding that it was already recognized, Métis self-determination and the Métis self-government under Section 35. I'm wondering if she could clarify that for me.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the opportunity to elaborate. So, this legislation recognizes the Manitoba Métis Federation as an Indigenous government mandated to represent the Red River Métis in respect of their right to self-government, and recognizes the law-making powers of the Manitoba Métis Federation in areas related to the internal organization and governance, which includes matters like the determination of citizenship, leadership selection, internal operations, accountability mechanisms, measures for administering Red River Métis laws, and enforcing violations of those laws. So the opportunity to add this to Canadian legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Winnipeg South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today we get to correct a historic wrong, and I want to thank the Minister for bringing C-21 to the House, the self-government treaty that she has introduced today. I want to applaud her, but Mr. Speaker, I also want to applaud our Minister of Public Safety, who did a lot of the work to bring this to fruition. I know that a number of the Manitoba MPs were at a special signing ceremony last year, and the Deputy House Leader was one of those. And today, indeed, is a very special day, and particularly a big shout out to the Manitoba Métis Federation, and particularly President Chartrand for his persistence and for his collaborative spirit in bringing us to today. But I'm wondering if the Minister could respond to how this signing this particular treaty and implementing this legislation shows the way on the reconciliation journey that all Canadians are on.
The Honourable Minister, a brief response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the importance of this legislation is that step one, establishing the self-governance of the Manitoba Métis Nation. And part of the legislation also talks about the opportunity for supplementary self-government arrangements. So the opportunity to negotiate the next steps would be language, culture and heritage, child and family services, health services, education. So the opportunity for the Manitoba Métis to be leading and in programs for their people, I think, is an important next step. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise du débat. L'honorable député de Joliette.
Manawan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Bloc québécois est évidemment favorable au principe du projet de loi et je salue la ministre et son discours.
C-21 met en œuvre le premier traité moderne conclu entre le Canada et un gouvernement métis, ce qui représente un jalon historique pour les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge. Le chef de la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba, M. David Chartrand, rappelait d'ailleurs récemment en comité que c'est surtout un traité symbolique dont il s'agit ici. Les Métis, ici, ne réclament aucun financement ni quoi que ce soit au gouvernement fédéral que le droit d'avoir un traité de reconnaissance qui leur a été promis. Promis il y a longtemps, Monsieur le Président, on corrige ici une injustice historique en donnant suite, avec plus de 150 ans de retard, à la promesse de traité faite à Louis Riel et à son gouvernement provisoire au moment de l'entrée du Manitoba dans la Confédération. Il répond au traitement historique honteux réservé par le Canada aux Métis. Marginalisation, déni de leurs droits, répression militaire, invisibilisation dans l'éducation en posant enfin une reconnaissance juridique et politique explicite. Ce projet de loi s'inscrit dans une logique de collaboration de nation à nation en reconnaissant formellement la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba comme gouvernement des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge et en établissant un cadre politique durable de relations intergouvernementales. Le traité affirme clairement l'unité politique des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge comme collectivité autochtone distincte avec un gouvernement démocratique reconnu plutôt que comme une simple addition de communautés dispersées. Il consacre le droit à l'autodétermination et à l'autonomie gouvernementale des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge en reconnaissant que ce droit est itinérant et protégé par la Constitution et ne dépend plus du bon vouloir politique d'Ottawa. Le contenu du traité porte d'abord sur la régie interne du peuple métis de la Rivière-Rouge, citoyenneté, institutions, élections, reddition de comptes, fonctionnement du gouvernement, puis ne vient pas empiéter sur les compétences des autres ordres de gouvernement. Il résulte d'un processus de co-création puis de négociation soutenu entre le Canada et la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba, où les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge ont défini eux-mêmes leurs priorités de gouvernance plutôt que de se voir imposer un modèle unilatéral. Ce traité est l'aboutissement d'un processus entamé formellement en 2018 et respecte les exigences de fond et de forme d'un véritable traité moderne, à la différence d'autres initiatives comme le projet de loi C-33, parce que ceux-ci ne passaient pas par une telle négociation et reconnaissance explicite de l'autonomie gouvernementale et poussaient plutôt pour un chèque en blanc au gouvernement fédéral dans sa négociation avec d'autres nations qui se disaient métisses. Monsieur le Président, comme vous le savez, C-21, c'est un projet de loi d'initiative gouvernementale proposé par la ministre ici, qui vient de faire un discours, la ministre des Relations couronne autochtone. C-21 commence avec la reconnaissance politique et juridique graduelle de la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba comme gouvernement des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge. À partir de 2018, le Canada puis la FMM engagent des négociations formelles d'autonomie gouvernementale sous l'égide du ministère des Relations couronne autochtone afin de passer d'une simple entente politique à un véritable traité moderne encadrant les institutions de gouvernance. Une étape clé, Monsieur le Président, survient en 2021 lorsqu'une entente de reconnaissance confirme la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba comme gouvernement métis et interlocuteur du Canada pour les droits des intérêts collectifs des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge. Cette entente sert de socle aux travaux plus ambitieux sur l'autonomie gouvernementale et prépare la reconnaissance de pouvoirs législatifs internes plus étendus. Ce processus aboutit le 30 novembre 2024 à la signature officielle du traité concernant la reconnaissance et la mise en œuvre de l'autonomie gouvernementale des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge à Winnipeg par le président de la FMM, M. David Chartrand, et le ministre fédéral qui s'occupe aujourd'hui de la sécurité publique. Le communiqué gouvernemental présente ce traité comme unique en son genre et comme le premier traité d'autonomie gouvernementale conclu avec un gouvernement métis au Canada, réaffirmant le droit à l'autodétermination des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge puis reconnaissant explicitement la MMF comme leur gouvernement de la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba, avec la capacité de légiférer sur la citoyenneté, la sélection des dirigeants puis le fonctionnement interne de ces institutions. On y souligne que le traité est centré sur la gouvernance plutôt que sur les terres ou les droits de récolte et que, une fois mis en vigueur par la loi, il sera protégé par la Constitution, venant remplacer l'entente de reconnaissance de 2021 et marquant un jalon majeur dans la réconciliation avec ce peuple autochtone. Après la signature du traité, la relation entre le Canada puis la Fédération entre dans une phase de mise en œuvre durant laquelle les parties préparent l'instrument législatif nécessaire pour donner force de loi au traité dans l'ordre juridique canadien. Le traité lui-même prévoit la négociation d'autres arrangements d'autonomie gouvernementale et un cadre de collaboration et de consultation avec d'autres groupes autochtones, mais son entrée en vigueur pleine et entière dépend d'une loi fédérale qui l'entérine et l'intègre au droit interne. C'est dans ce contexte que le 12 février dernier, la ministre des Relations couronnes autochtones dépose à la Chambre des communes, ici même, le projet de loi C-21, loi portant mise en vigueur du traité concernant la reconnaissance et la mise en œuvre de l'autonomie gouvernementale des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge et modifiant d'autres lois en conséquence dont on discute cet après-midi. Le communiqué qui accompagne ce dépôt rappelle qu'il s'agit, comme je l'ai dit quelques fois, du premier traité d'autonomie gouvernementale conclu avec un gouvernement métis. Donc, c'est présenté comme l'aboutissement de 156 années d'efforts des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge depuis 1870. Puis le communiqué explique que le projet de loi vise à donner force de loi au traité, à reconnaître la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba comme gouvernement des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge et à préciser les pouvoirs législatifs de ce gouvernement dans les domaines internes visés par le traité. Monsieur le Président, on a parlé, le traité vise à reconnaître puis mettre en œuvre le droit à l'autodétermination puis l'autonomie gouvernementale des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge en s'inscrivant dans une approche de réconciliation qui est conforme à la Déclaration des Nations unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Il est expressément qualifié de traité au sens des articles 25 et 35 de la Loi constitutionnelle de 82, à force de loi, lie le Canada, la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba et toutes les personnes et organismes et engage l'honneur de la Couronne. Le traité rappelle aussi l'histoire coloniale, le rôle historique des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge, résistance de la Rivière-Rouge, Assemblée législative d'Assiniboia, cause de la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba contre le Canada, puis la responsabilité du Canada de remédier à, je vais le dire en anglais, l'Unfinished Business of Reconciliation, lié notamment à l'article 31 de la loi de 1870 sur le Manitoba. Le traité affirme que les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge sont une collectivité autochtone distincte qui détient collectivement des droits protégés par l'article 35, dont le droit inhérent à l'autonomie gouvernementale, puis que la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba et leur gouvernement démocratique et leurs représentants exclusifs pour les droits et intérêts collectifs, y compris les droits de l'article 35 puis les revendications liées aux terres. De plus, le traité confirme que le droit à l'autodétermination puis le droit inhérent à l'autonomie gouvernementale des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge ne dépendent pas de la reconnaissance du Canada ni de la loi de mise en œuvre, mais sont explicitement reconnus et affirmés comme droits de l'article 35 et protégés par l'article 25 de la Charte. Il précise qu'aucun droit de l'article 35 des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge n'est éteint ou cédé, que les droits de gouvernance énumérés ne sont pas exhaustifs et que d'autres domaines d'autonomie pourront être ajoutés par des arrangements complémentaires d'autonomie gouvernementale ultérieure. Le chapitre 4 définit les compétences particulières des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge, c'est-à-dire les domaines où la Fédération peut légiférer, avec préséance sur le droit fédéral en cas de conflit ou d'incompatibilité dans ces domaines. Les domaines que je vais énumérer, Monsieur le Président. Citoyenneté des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge, donc critères de citoyenneté, enregistrement, renonciation, recours, avec exigence d'un lien démontrable avec les Métis historiques de la Rivière-Rouge. Le registre actuel de la Fédération devient le registre officiel. En principe, une personne ne peut pas être à la fois citoyen des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge et membre citoyen d'une autre collectivité autochtone reconnue, Première Nation, autre Métis ou traité moderne, sauf s'il est incapable de renoncer à cette autre qualité. Le traité n'empêche pas les individus de choisir un autre corps autochtone. Dans les domaines, la suite des domaines, il y a la méthode de sélection des représentants de la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba. C'est la Fédération qui a compétence complète sur ses processus électoraux et de désignation de ses représentants, membres, dirigeants, etc. Il y a aussi les structures, fonctionnement, finances et responsabilités de la Fédération, donc l'organisation interne, gestion des actifs, gestion financière, règles de responsabilité civile et d'immunité personnelle des dirigeants et employés, privilèges et immunités comparables à ceux des parlementaires et régime d'accès à l'information et de protection de renseignements personnels au sein de la Fédération. Il y a aussi la responsabilité démocratique. La Fédération des Métis du Manitoba peut adopter ses propres règles de reddition de comptes envers les citoyens métis, donc prévention des conflits d'intérêts, mécanismes internes, etc. Il y a aussi l'administration, l'exécution, les poursuites et les adjudications. La Fédération peut créer des institutions pour administrer ses lois, prévoir des sanctions, amendes, restitutions, emprisonnement dans certaines limites, intégrer des sanctions traditionnelles proportionnées, puis mettre en place des mécanismes d'application des poursuites de ces lois. Dans tous ces champs, lorsque la loi Métis et la loi fédérale entrent en conflit ou sont incompatibles, la loi des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge prévaut dans la mesure du conflit pour les matières clairement visées par le traité. Il y a aussi la fiscalité et le financement. Le traité définit la notion de besoin de dépenses et de mécanismes fiscaux censés permettre à la Fédération de disposer d'une capacité financière comparable à celle d'autres gouvernements ou organismes publics accomplissant des fonctions similaires. Ces arrangements fiscaux sont négociés entre les parties et précisent les contributions fédérales puis les responsabilités de la Fédération. Ils ne font pas partie du traité au sens des articles 25 et 35, mais sont encadrés par le traité. Le traité consacre la compétence de la Fédération en matière d'accès à l'information et de protection des renseignements personnels détenus par ces institutions en s'inspirant des régimes publics existants, mais adaptés à la réalité métisse. Il reconnaît aussi un rôle spécifique de la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba en matière de culture et de langue métisse de la Rivière-Rouge, ainsi qu'en matière de services à l'enfance et à la famille, notamment dans le contexte de la loi fédérale sur les enfants, les jeunes et les familles des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis. Le traité précise qu'il n'affecte pas la Constitution du Canada, n'abroge ni ne déroge aux autres droits des peuples autochtones et n'empêche pas l'existence d'autres collectivités métisses distinctes pouvant détenir leurs propres droits d'article 35. Il affirme que rien dans le traité ne limite les droits futurs des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge, ni la possibilité de reconnaître de nouvelles compétences de gouvernance par négociation. Il doit être interprété de manière à maintenir et non à amoindrir les droits de l'article 35. Monsieur le Président, la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba est créée en 1967 pour assurer une gouvernance, 1967, pour assurer une gouvernance démocratique, responsable et imputable au nom des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge sur la base de pouvoirs constitutionnels que lui délèguent ses citoyens. Elle se constitue ensuite en personne morale pour répondre à une exigence du gouvernement fédéral liée à l'accès au programme. Les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge sont définis comme une collectivité autochtone composée de ses citoyens et des personnes ayant droit à la citoyenneté, vivant au Manitoba ainsi qu'ailleurs au Canada et à l'étranger. Sur le plan identitaire, la Fédération des Métis du Manitoba affirme s'appuyer sur la résolution de 2002 du ralliement national des Métis concernant la définition de la nation métisse et se présente comme la continuité de la seule et unique nation métisse rattachée à ses origines de la Rivière-Rouge. Elle se donne pour mission de protéger les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge au-delà des frontières, sur l'ensemble de leur territoire ancestral et partout où vivent ses citoyens, y compris à l'extérieur du Manitoba, et se décrit comme gardienne de la nation métisse et de sa définition nationale. La Fédération situe cette démarche dans le contexte de l'héritage colonial, en soulignant que les frontières provinciales et autres limites institutionnelles ont fragmenté le territoire traditionnel et la gouvernance métisse. Depuis 2014, elle affirme avoir entrepris des démarches pour réunir les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge et préciser que la citoyenneté à la Fédération ne dépend pas de la résidence au Manitoba. L'organisation inscrit également son évolution dans une continuité historique plus longue. Depuis l'ethnogenèse du peuple métis, elle met de l'avant 3 institutions de gouvernance, la présidence, le conseil ou cabinet, et l'Assemblée, qu'elle fait remonter aux structures de décision collective de l'époque des chasses aux bisons. Ces institutions, issues d'une histoire marquée par des pratiques culturelles, des campagnes militaires et des luttes politiques, sont décrites comme un héritage durement acquis et toujours en évolution. Dans leur configuration actuelle, le président de la Fédération, M. Chartrand, et un cabinet de 22 ministres rendent des comptes à l'Assemblée et sollicitent son orientation, l'Assemblée étant présentée comme centrale pour assurer une gouvernance ouverte, responsable et démocratique. La Fédération administre enfin un large éventail de programmes et de services, notamment en protection de l'enfance et de la famille, justice, logement, jeunesse, éducation, ressources humaines, développement économique et ressources naturelles, s'appuyant pour cela sur un ensemble de sociétés, offices et agences affiliées regroupant plus de 1100 employés. Aussi, Monsieur le Président, je vous rappelle que les Métis de la Rivière-Rouge forment, au 19e siècle, une société issue des Autochtones, surtout des Premières Nations des Plaines, et des Européens liés à la traite des fourrures, principalement dans la région de la colonie de la Rivière-Rouge, au cœur de l'actuel Manitoba. Dès le début du siècle, ils jouent un rôle central dans l'économie du Nord-Ouest comme chasseurs de bisons, fournisseurs de pemmican et intermédiaires dans le commerce des fourrures, tout en développant une culture distincte, à la fois catholique et francophone pour une large part, mais aussi anglophone et protestante, avec des pratiques collectives comme les grandes chasses organisées selon des règles démocratiques. La colonie de la Rivière-Rouge, fondée en 1812 sous l'égide de la Compagnie de la baie d'Hudson et de Lord Selkirk, devient progressivement un foyer démographique où les métis francophones et anglophones représentent une proportion importante de la population et se dotent de leurs propres leaders, dont Cuthbert Grant, puis plus tard Louis Riel. À partir des années 1860, le contexte change brutalement avec la volonté du Canada d'étendre sa souveraineté vers l'Ouest. En 1869, la Compagnie de la baie d'Hudson vend la terre de Rupert aux Dominions du Canada sans consulter les habitants métis, ce qui fait craindre la remise en cause de leur terre, de leur langue et de leur religion, d'autant que les arpenteurs canadiens arrivent sur le terrain sans garantie claire sur les titres fonciers. En octobre 1869, les Métis bloquent les travaux d'arpentage et, sous la direction de Louis Riel et d'autres chefs, s'emparent d'Upper Fort Garry, le principal poste de la compagnie, afin de forcer Ottawa à négocier les conditions de l'entrée de la région dans la Confédération. Ils mettent sur pied un comité national des Métis puis un gouvernement provisoire formé de Métis francophones et anglophones qui élabore une liste de droits servant de base à la loi sur le Manitoba. Les négociations menées par le gouvernement provisoire conduisent à l'acte du Manitoba de 1870 qui crée la province, reconnaît les institutions bilingues et des écoles confessionnelles et prévoit une attribution de 1,4 million d'acres aux enfants de familles métisses pour régler leur, entre guillemets, là, titre indien à la terre, c'est les termes de l'époque. Toutefois, la mise en œuvre de ces promesses est chaotique et retardée et l'exécution de l'orangiste Thomas Scott par un tribunal métis en mars 1870 déclenche une violente hostilité anti-métis en Ontario, entraînant l'envoi d'un corps expéditionnaire qui se livre à des représailles et à des violences contre la population métisse. Dans ce climat de peur, une partie importante des métis quitte la région, migrent vers l'ouest, actuel Saskatchewan et Alberta, ou vers le sud, et perdent progressivement leur position majoritaire au Manitoba, où ils ne représentent plus qu'une faible part de la population dans les années 1880. La rébellion du Nord-Ouest de 1885 constitue le second grand soulèvement mené par les Métis et certains alliés des Premières Nations contre le gouvernement canadien fédéral dans le prolongement des événements de la Rivière-Rouge. Dans les années 1870-80, les Métis installés dans les territoires du Nord-Ouest dénoncent l'absence de titre clair sur leurs terres, l'inaction du gouvernement face à leurs pétitions et la dégradation de leurs conditions économiques après l'effondrement du bison, ce qui nourrit un sentiment de marginalisation et d'injustice. En 1884, des délégués métis font revenir Louis Riel de son exil au Montana pour structurer leurs revendications. Il rédige une nouvelle liste de réclamations et, devant l'absence de réponse satisfaisante d'Ottawa, le mouvement glisse vers la confrontation armée. Au printemps 1885, un gouvernement provisoire est instauré à Batoche sous l'autorité politique de Riel et la direction militaire de Gabriel Dumont. Après quelques succès initiaux, les Métis et leurs alliés sont finalement défaits à la bataille de Batoche en mai 1885 par le major général britannique Frederick Middleton, ses troupes de paramilitaires de la police montée du Nord-Ouest et les milices volontaires, surtout orangistes. Le major général Middleton était par ailleurs passé maître dans la répression de révoltes des peuples autochtones, ayant gagné ses galons notamment contre les Maoris en Nouvelle-Zélande. Je vois que mon temps file, Monsieur le Président. J'aurais voulu en dire plus sur l'histoire, l'évolution de ces événements-là. Par exemple, le premier ministre Honoré Mercier au Québec va dire « Louis Riel, notre frère, est mort ». Le 22 novembre, devant une foule énorme rassemblée au Champ de Mars à Montréal. La reddition de Riel, son procès pour haute trahison et son exécution en novembre 1885, ainsi que les sanctions imposées à plusieurs chefs autochtones, marquent une défaite politique et militaire majeure pour les Métis. Aujourd'hui, on a ici un rôle important de réparation de l'injustice qui a été faite à cette nation-là depuis toutes ces décennies-là, depuis plus d'un siècle et demi. Et sincèrement, Monsieur le Président, je salue ce projet de loi et je veux leur dire que je suis et que le Bloc québécois, nous sommes de tout cœur avec eux. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
And before we go to questions and comments, order, it is my duty pursuant to Standing Order 38 to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The Honourable Member for Riding Mountain, Mental Health and Addictions, the Honourable Member for Similkameen, South Okanagan, West Kootenay, the Economy, and the Honourable Member for York-Durham, Housing. Questions and comments. Question et commentaire, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, when I think of the Red River Métis Nation, I think of Louis Riel. And when I think in terms of Louis Riel today, it was just a couple of years ago, where we actually recognized Louis Riel as Manitoba's first premier. And further to that, when I think in terms of the Manitoba Métis Federation, I've been a parliamentarian for over 3 decades now, and it has been such a wonderful thing to witness firsthand how MMF has stood consistently to ensure that the Red River Métis Nation not only continues to live on, but in essence carry the city of Winnipeg, our province, and indeed our country in many ways. We hear of individuals like David Chartrand, Will, and others that have actually ensured and instilled in the minds of so many Canadians how important it is to recognize the Red River Métis Nation, the fine work that the MMF does. I think it's worthy in terms of just recognizing, Mr. Speaker, to see a strong presence of MMF on the parliamentary precinct today. I know they're listening to the debate. My question to the member is, would you not agree it would be a wonderful thing to see a debate potentially collapse so we can actually get this significant piece of legislation through the House of Commons?
L'honorable député de Joliette-Manawan.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux remercier l'honorable collègue pour ses commentaires et sa question. Oui, c'est important d'aller de l'avant, de mettre ça de l'avant. Moi, je me dis, s'il y a 150 ans, ça ne s'était pas passé comme ça, s'il y avait eu un respect de cette nation-là et le respect de garantie des droits, s'il n'avait pas été floué, combien leur culture rayonnerait et on pourrait en bénéficier aujourd'hui. Mieux vaut tard que jamais. Je salue sincèrement l'engagement du gouvernement et de la ministre à cet effet. Et une anecdote, Monsieur le Président, hein, on est bientôt le 1er mai, la journée des droits des travailleuses et travailleurs, suite aux grèves puis aux bouleversements aux États-Unis, à Chicago. Mais ces associations-là avaient dit que Louis Riel était leur frère et ils souhaitaient sa libération et dénonçaient tout ce qui était fait. Donc, c'est un leader inspirant pour une journée qui est célébrée par toutes les travailleuses et travailleurs aujourd'hui dans le monde qui saluaient l'exemple de Louis Riel. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank my colleague for his question. Currently, the Canadian Energy Regulator has confirmed that Manitoba Métis Federation does some level of consultation in northern BC for major projects, environment effects on traditional Section 35 rights. Should one day Métis be in Quebec and they want to acknowledge Section 35 rights there, would my colleague from the Bloc Quebecois be okay with that level of new jurisdiction in Quebec as well?
L'honorable député de Joliette-Manawan.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le collègue pour sa question, qui m'avait remercié pour la question que je n'avais pas posée. Évidemment, nous, au Québec, on reconnaît pleinement le droit de toutes les nations autochtones, Premières Nations, Inuits, Métis. Et notre position ici, c'est de négocier de nation en nation. Et je rappellerai ce qu'avait fait l'ancien premier ministre du Québec, M. Feu Bernard Landry, qui avait négocié la paix des Braves, qui est un exemple en la matière. Donc, c'est pas juste dire « on va essayer de vous avoir de tout ça ». Non, on reconnaît pleinement qui vous êtes, votre culture, votre nation. On doit respecter votre territoire, vos ressources. Et je vous dirais, actuellement, il n'y a plus d'entente de développement économique qui se fait où il ne faut pas que ça arrive plus jamais, sans que les droits des Premières Nations, des Autochtones, des Métis soient au cœur des négociations, soient pleinement respectés. Là, ici, on corrige symboliquement une erreur d'il y a 150 ans. Il ne faut plus jamais reproduire le colonialisme qui s'est fait au cours des 150 dernières années. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Shefford.
Président, on a vu, particulièrement au début d'année, que la connaissance de l'histoire est à géométrie variable. Et pourtant, pour savoir où l'on va, il faut savoir d'où l'on vient. Il y a un dicton qui dit ça. il y a des liens directs et très étroits entre les Métis et le Québec. Mon collègue semble avoir passé un petit peu rapidement en fin de discours sur la question de l'histoire. Est-ce qu'il y aurait quelques éléments historiques qu'il aimerait ajouter pour complément d'information? Merci beaucoup. Et je remercie mon...
L'honorable député de Joliette-Manawan.
Oui, je remercie collègue et ami de Shefford pour son intervention. L'histoire des Métis de la Rivière-Rouge du Manitoba, tout ce qui s'est passé là, c'est fondamental dans l'identité puis la culture des Canadiens français qui vont devenir les Québécois. En fait, ça a été l'emprisonnement puis la pendaison de Louis Riel. Ça a été, selon plusieurs historiens, le déclencheur de la prise de conscience, de dire « OK, wow, il s'est passé quelque chose là », puis c'est notre frère qui ont pendu, comme le disait Honoré Mercier. Puis aussi, je répéterai pas en cette chambre la triste réplique de Sir Johnny MacDonald qui nous traitait comme des animaux parce qu'on était contre ce qui venait de se faire aux leaders des Métis. Donc, pour nous, on est arrivé à une prise de conscience à ce moment-là et plus tard, l'écrivain et penseur Jacques Ferron va dire « c'est même là qu'il y a eu pour la première fois une identité de Québécois ». Suite à ça, ça va être l'élément qui va déclencher ça en disant « nos frères ont été dispersés et réprimés dans l'Ouest, donc qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire dans la province du Québec pour se soutenir? » Donc, de tout cœur avec nos frères et nos sœurs métis. Merci, M. le Président.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Minister, Crown-Indigenous Relations.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux remercier mon collègue pour l'appui sur le traité et pour beaucoup d'histoires et toute son connaissance à propos de les Métis. J'avais la même question. Je voulais savoir s'il y avait une autre histoire que vous voulez partager avec la Chambre pour qu'on pense à ça. Et j'espère que toute la Chambre va laisser le débat collapser aujourd'hui à la fin de le débat. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable député de Joliette-Manawan.
Oui, bien, je remercie vraiment sincèrement la ministre pour son excellent discours, l'excellent projet de loi qui vient s'assurer que le traité a force de loi dans cette Chambre au Canada. Oui, j'espère qu'on va pouvoir arriver à la fin du débat aujourd'hui pour qu'il soit adopté plus rapidement. J'aurais des tonnes d'autres anecdotes ou histoires ou du point de vue du Québec ou du point de vue de ce que j'ai pu lire là, pour la nation métisse et l'histoire du Canada. Je rappellerais que les Premières Nations, les Autochtones, les Métis ont, dans les premières décennies, premiers siècles de l'histoire du Canada, été constamment floués. Par exemple, dans la guerre qui opposait l'Empire britannique, qui avait le territoire canadien, et les Américains, on avait promis, la couronne britannique avait promis un État aux Premières Nations dans l'Ouest canadien, État qui ne sera jamais avéré finalement. Donc, il est temps qu'on répare les injustices passées et le traité, le C-21 aujourd'hui, est un pas dans ce sens-là. Donc, je remercie sincèrement la ministre. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Questions and comments. We have time for one final question. Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm honored today to rise and to speak on this bill and to the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty. I want to begin with respect for the Manitoba Métis Federation. The work we discussed today did not appear overnight. It reflects years, decades of organizing, advocacy, negotiation, constitutional work done by the Manitoba Métis Federation and the Red River Métis citizens. The Red River Métis people have fought for recognition and their place on the land before Canada became a country in 1867. In most recent history, the agreement itself records a long path: a 2016 Framework Agreement, a 2018 Incremental Reconciliation Plan, a 2000 Interim Fiscal Financing Agreement, and a 2021 Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Agreement, all leading up to today. The treaty also links itself to the unfinished reconciliation identified in the Manitoba Métis Federation versus Canada action. I want to acknowledge President Chartrand and his leadership that has led to the Manitoba Métis Federation becoming a socio-economic driving force in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and beyond. Second, I also want to show respect for those other Indigenous governments for helping with the conversation about what could be improved in the treaty, and for their courage to respectfully bringing their concerns to the broader discussion. I know from experience that Indigenous critics can experience the most severe forms of abuse from outsiders and insiders via lateral violence, despite the shared goal of building solid foundations for future generations. As members of Parliament, we have a duty to combat such abuse and bring respectful dialogue to such important matters. And this is a very important matter. We need to take the time to make sure this bill that proposes to bring the agreement into Canadian law and constitutional law is well built. This is why this debate should not be reduced to a false choice between reconciliation and scrutiny. Parliament can support reconciliation and still insist on precision. In fact, when legislation will constitutionalize a treaty under Sections 25 and 35, precision is a part of reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, Conservatives support treaty rights. We support Métis self-government. We support modern agreements that are durable, constitutional, and workable. And we even support the Manitoba Métis Federation's choice, as is their right, to negotiate and enter into an agreement that empowers them to move away from Ottawa bureaucracy. As a First Nations person, I would not personally support growing the ISC bureaucracy as a part of implementing this treaty, but a key part of the Manitoba Métis Federation's self-governance is their freedom to choose their partners, even if ISC has shown a long history of being unreliable and abusive to other Indigenous communities. But supporting the Manitoba Métis Federation's self-determination and governance over their own people does not require us as legislators to ignore potential challenges with implementation. It requires us to confront them before they become drawn-out lawsuits, which can still happen despite the best efforts of drafters to anticipate and resolve disputes in a more conciliatory ways. It requires us to ask whether consultation in other Indigenous communities was sufficient to anticipate the potential challenges that this treaty might face. The first reason for caution is that the treaty itself says that it is a treaty within the meaning of Sections 25 and 35, and that it has the force of law and is binding on all persons and bodies and engages the honour of the Crown. Once Parliament gives effect to that, the courts, not the ministers, become the final interpreters of what this text means. If Parliament leaves ambiguity in a constitutional instrument, Parliament is not choosing flexibility, it is risking future litigation. The implementation legislation before us would give the treaty and future Manitoba Métis Federation laws the force of federal law, which would prevail in many areas over inconsistent other federal laws. Among other features, it has the potential to give non-Manitoba Métis Federation police forces and provinces the power to enforce Manitoba Métis Federation laws on non-members of Manitoba Métis Federation, including the power to prosecute and imprison accused individuals. Because the Manitoba Métis Federation is not definitively geographically bound or defined in the treaty, Manitoba Métis Federation laws could potentially apply anywhere inside Western Canada and beyond. Several Métis groups have made the point that Manitoba Métis Federation jurisdiction should not extend to other Métis traditional homelands and territories, and that it should be up to the Métis justice systems, not the Crown courts, to determine what Métis laws mean and how they apply. Modern treaties have the opportunity to place Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations into a shared legal system where we can build certainty, continuity, transparency, and predictability. Ambiguous modern treaty drafting can produce years of conflict. It is not fear-mongering to remember the decades of history where interpretation and poor relations have resulted in unintended division, and Canada still lives that today. We see this playing out in British Columbia. Governments, federal and provincial, are learning hard lessons, focusing their work on reconciliatory rhetoric rather than the hard work needed to bring as many people along as possible, Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians alike. There is much in the treaty that deserves acknowledgement. It recognizes Red River Métis self-determination and the inherent right of self-government. It recognizes the Manitoba Métis Federation as the government of the Red River Métis in paragraph 9. It provides concrete jurisdiction now over citizenship, leadership, selection, internal operations, accountability, administration, enforcement, and related matters. This is serious work and it deserves respect. But But respect for the work done by the Manitoba Métis Federation does not erase the duty of Parliament to ask what this text does, what it does not do, and what may be read to do later. The next area of concern is the definition of Red River Métis, relationships with other Métis governments, and the question of constitutional space for others. The Red River Métis should be the ultimate authority on determining who is Red River Métis. Paragraph 1 defines that the Red River Métis as an Indigenous collectivity originally established within the historic Northwest, centered in the Red River Valley, distinct from any other Indigenous collectivity and collectivity holding Section 35 rights, including the inherent right to self-government. Paragraph 10 then says the Red River Métis acts exclusively through the Manitoba Métis Federation in exercising collective rights held rights in pursuing script claims and in the Crown consultation respecting potential adverse effects on Red River Métis Section 35 rights. Paragraph 19 adds that any existing Section 35 rights of self-government in the respect of the definition of Red River Métis and the exclusive representation of the Red River Métis by the Manitoba Métis Federation continue and will be exercised in accordance with the treaty. To many Red River Métis citizens, these provisions are long overdue recognition and nation building. That perspective needs to be heard. But to other Métis governments, those same provisions raise alarms. The treaty's definitions and scope are read as expansive and ambiguous. We have heard from other Métis nations the concern the treaty may fail to leave constitutional space for other Métis groups. Once implemented, it will be binding on third parties, including other federalized Métis governments. Self-government agreements and treaties with different Métis and other Indigenous governments must coexist with each other. There are strengths in drafting this agreement with flexibility and limiting language, but there is also too much ambiguity. Paragraph 13 says nothing in the treaty may be interpreted to determine the geographical location or the extent of the Red River Métis. There is also nothing in the treaty to imply that the Red River Métis is the only Métis collective under Section 35. It also does not imply that the Manitoba Métis Federation represents any other Indigenous collectivity other than the Red River Métis. It preserves the possibility that there are other Métis collective rights holders, which is a good thing, established before the effective European control that included individuals within Red River Métis ancestry and made hold distinct Section 35 rights. Those are important safeguards, and any fair reading of the treaty should say so. There is respect from other Métis governments that have also worked for years in securing their own recognition of their own rights-bearing communities and self-government agreements. Their concern is not that the Manitoba Métis Federation should have no treaty, quite the opposite. Various Métis groups appreciate, celebrate, and support Canada's modern treaty making with the Métis governments and recognize the Manitoba Métis Federation's right to pursue self-determination through this agreement. A second area of concern is land and Aboriginal rights and ambiguity. Supporters of this bill frame this as an internal governance treaty, not a land claims treaty. The treaty's immediate operative jurisdictions are about governance, citizenship, internal structures, accountability, adjudication, and related institutional matters, not a direct land transfer. In recent months, disagreements about how treaties and other agreements about land-based rights should be interpreted has led to much uncertainty on the part of Canadians and much undeserved ignorance, interpretation, and hatred directed towards Indigenous peoples. Knowing that Canada's failure to be precise and failure to communicate about several recent agreements in BC has caused harm to everyone. If Canada wants to say now the Manitoba Métis Federation Treaty does not recognize land-related rights, it has a duty to spell that out explicitly, inclusive of protecting fee simple property. Too often it seems the current government wants to intentionally leave in that ambiguity so they can take credit but not responsibility for the decisions made. Why does this matter? Chapter 9 lays out the process for future supplementary self-government arrangements in areas including wildlife, migratory birds, fishing, harvesting, and management, environmental assessment, protection, administrative of justice, and any other matters reasonably related to self-determination, self-government, or other rights and interests of the Métis, Red River Métis. For many First Nations and other Indigenous peoples, a traditional paradigm is that we are a part of the land, inclusive of wildlife and plant life. Paragraph 88 goes further and says that the treaty contemplates future negotiation or recognition of Manitoba Métis Federation jurisdiction over lands that may be held in the Red River Métis, and the preamble of the treaty itself refers to the unfulfilled land grant provisions of the Manitoba Act, implying the potential for redress. For non-Indigenous Canadians, especially those worried about their recreational or life-sustaining use of the land, it is important not to inflame fear. This treaty does not, on its face, threaten fee simple title. It does not contain a clause expropriating private home ownership, but it does create a legal framework that can affect future consultation questions, future jurisdictional negotiations, and future litigation over the scope of rights. The responsible position is neither alarmist nor denial. It is clarity. For Indigenous folks, especially Métis, First Nations, and Inuit people, the issue is equally serious but different. It is whether the constitutionality can be protected via treaty can be drafted in a way that leaves room for one Indigenous government's hard-won recognition without crowding the constitutional room needed by others. It is whether reconciliation is being advanced through careful pluralism or through avoidable conflict. It is also about whether an Indigenous community needs recognition in a treaty in order for their self-government rights to be exercised. The Liberal government must acknowledge the pushback it received on Bill C-53 in consideration of this bill, not because the Manitoba Métis Federation is in the same category as other Métis in question in C-53, but because other Indigenous concerns were expressed explicitly. The fundamental question must be answered by the government, a question that I have received and I know this Liberal government has received as well. How will this treaty overlap with the historic numbered treaties in Canada? We cannot shy away from the fact that the Assembly of Treaty Chiefs in Alberta recently passed a resolution against this proposed treaty in question today. The Chiefs of Treaty 3 in Ontario have said in a submission to the Liberal government that they have concerns about pre-approved modern treaties that will supersede historic Confederation-era treaties, practically making them second-class citizens. We have heard, and we know that the Liberal government too, that there has been little to no consultations with First Nations across the numbered treaties in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba regarding this bill. The Liberal government has stated a significant consultation on Bill S2 while doing no consultation on things like C5, and now again First Nations are questioning the inconsistent politics being played by this government when consultation is used and when it's not used. These concerns are real, and I know the Manitoba Métis Federation is aware of these concerns from First Nations as well. I don't hear any Indigenous nation, Métis, Inuit, or First Nation wanting to see other Indigenous peoples fail, but the process and details must be addressed. All of these types of agreements and treaties must live together, and we as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples must coexist. A third area of concern is everyday predictability in governance and how we grow the Canadian economy. The Canadian Energy Regulators process in British Columbia has seen the Manitoba Métis Federation relying on the treaty and the Red River Métis homeland claims to assert consultation rights far beyond the Red River 2 provinces away. This can result in confusion, cost, and delay in resource development. The impacts are not only political disputes, but real on-the-ground impacts that can hold back timely growth of Canada's economy for all treaty peoples. As Parliament constitutionalizes a treaty whose wording and surrounding narratives are already being used in regulatory settings, Parliament has a duty to consider how wording matters outside this chamber. The commitment to a financial arrangement which would meet the expenditure need of the Manitoba Métis Federation to exercise its defined self-government functions is good in concept but poorly spelled out. Those IOUs promise big buckets of potential rights and obligations and a bureaucratic framework to ensure that Ottawa will get plenty of say in how they want to maintain control over such agreements and this Indigenous nation. And that brings me to my final point. The fairest and most constructive position is not to attack the Manitoba Métis Federation or deny legitimacy of the Red River Métis self-government. It is to say we honor the work brought here by this treaty. We recognize the unfinished business of reconciliation. We accept the Manitoba Métis Federation has spent years building towards this milestone, but because this treaty will be constitutionally entrenched and binding on everyone, we owe it to the Manitoba Métis Federation, to other Métis governments, to First Nations, to provinces, and to everyday Canadians to draft the implementation legislation with maximum clarity. That means asking whether Bill C-21 should include explicit protections making it clear that this treaty does not negate other Métis agreements, does not make the Red River Métis the only Métis people under Section 35, does not constrain future negotiations on other Métis groups, and does not recognize land-related Section 35 rights unless Parliament intends to say so explicitly and protects private property of everyday Canadians. These proposals are not anti-reconciliation. They make reconciliation more stable, more transparent, and more durable at a time when many Canadians feel uncertain about where we are going. Mr. Speaker, modern treaties are too important to be carried out by implication where explicit language is available. Canada's own legal history teaches us that when treaty wording is uncertain, courts will spend years, sometimes generations, trying to reconstruct the common intention of the parties, while communities and Ottawa are left to deal with the unexpected consequences. Parliament still has time to reduce that uncertainty here. So let us proceed with respect for the Manitoba Métis Federation, respect for the rights of other bearing Métis communities, respect for Indigenous rights, respect for legal certainty, and respect for Canadians who deserve laws that are clear enough to understand and laws that promote unity, not down the road division. We look forward to discussing how to improve this bill in consideration of any amendments in committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Comments, question and commentary. The Honourable Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for the well thought out speech and for his final comment there about one of the best places, in my view, to discuss the details would be at committee. And so I am hoping that the members opposite will consider letting this debate collapse today, because I do think the best opportunity would be at committee to go through this detail. To your point about ensuring the Manitoba Métis, other rights holders, and all Canadians are able to express their support, provide amendments, and to raise any concerns they have. So again, I would hope that if the member opposite could speak to whether they would let the debate collapse today so that we can move this to committee to be studied more in detail. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, I thank the Minister for her question and all her hard work on the file. It is a very difficult file to find the balance and everything. I will say that, though, that debate at every aspect is very important. To be very blunt, I have heard from First Nations in the last 48 hours that have serious concerns. So every level of debate is important, but I do anticipate that this bill will move to committee so that those voices can also be heard in a timely manner.
Question en commentaire, l'honorable député de la Pointe-de-l'Île.
Merci. Félicitations à mon collègue pour son discours. Il a parlé beaucoup de l'importance que ce traité-là aussi n'interfère pas avec d'autres traités qui permettent les futurs traités avec d'autres Premières Nations, d'autres nations métisses soient faits dans l'harmonie. Alors, est-ce qu'il peut nous en dire un petit peu plus sur de quelle façon il pense que ce serait faisable de respecter l'ensemble des Premières Nations dans l'élaboration des traités?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, I thank my colleague from Quebec for his question, and I think we have to go back to basics. Too often, I think when it comes to Indigenous relations, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations alike, a lot of things are complicated, and they are. They are vastly complicated. This is a nation of many Inuit communities, many Métis communities, and 600-plus recognized First Nations across the country. And so that is a very complex process when negotiating new modern treaties. That said, going back to basics includes the respect of other First Nations, Indigenous groups in the conversation right from the get-go. We hear the Liberals say this all the time, learning their lesson in that regard. But I think the First Nations would want to be a part of the conversation, in particular when it comes to historic treaties, maybe some of the modern treaties, but more the historic treaties on the prairies, because that's where this is interpreted to be affected the most. And I would like to have seen them engaged in the conversation from the get-go in a more structured way rather than maybe a more government-defined way and structured way defined by them.
Questions, comments? Member for London, Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my Conservative colleague, the member from Edmonton Northwest, on his wonderful speech. I'm proud to rise in this House on behalf of the people of London Fanshawe. There is a small Indigenous population that lives in London Fanshawe. Regarding Bill C-21, question to my colleague is, with regards to this bill, how does it expand, or how's this treaty will affect the land or resource rights? Thank you.
A member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, there's some good things about this bill, and there's some things that I think that are a little too ambiguous. The first thing is that it does bring a level of certainty and new definitions to the Section 35 rights of Manitoba Métis Federation and the Red River Métis people. That's a very good thing, because certainty at the end of the day is good for investors, it's good for business, and it's good for things moving in a more structured way, in a more timely way. But also the ambiguous nature of this is that there are concerns from other Indigenous groups that this is encroaching on their territory, this is encroaching in their level of space or jurisdiction, and we have to hear those in consideration of implementing this bill. Because if we're going to create division amongst Indigenous groups, that's not something the Canadian government should be striving towards in the interest of creating business and moving this country forward.
Questions, comments? The member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I know I want to thank my honourable colleague for his well-informed contribution to this debate. But I wanted to ask him a little bit more about the concern he has about the lack of provision in the bill to safeguard the constitutional enshrined rights of other Indigenous people, something that he brought up a lot. And I also wanted to see what his understanding of the term that was used in the treaty, collectivity, they use the word collectivity versus peoples. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member for Edmonton Northwest.
I thank my colleague from Winnipeg for the question. And again, yes, I'm First Nation. I'm a former chief. I'm from the United Cree Nation. That's where my roots come from. But I also have Métis roots, to be frank. I have a Métis grandfather. And so, it's very difficult as a member of Parliament to balance that, to balance all the hats we wear, and to be a Canadian, a Canadian that, a member of Parliament that represents everybody else beyond the distinction of Indigenous peoples. And so this bill is very important. It is a precedent setter when it comes to Métis governments, and it's going to go up against scrutiny against historic treaties who haven't been implemented, and the Honour of Crown hasn't been upheld. And so First Nations, rightly so, have a position of they would like to see that honour upheld in consideration before anything else comes to this space. I don't think they have to come. I think that discussion can line a solution there. We'll move forward in that. And collectivity, I do think there's ambiguity in that term. I think it has to be better defined in consideration of other Métis groups.
Questions and comments. Member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, I was interesting listening to many of the comments that the members put on the record today, and there's a bit of an expectation that we would in fact allow, at least afford the opportunity to hear more of the comments, maybe answer some specific questions, allowing the legislation to get to a standing committee. The time on the floor is wonderful. We'll get opportunities in third reading and so forth, but to see it go to a standing committee is really important, I think, not only to the Métis Nation, but to Canadians and the interest of Canadians as a whole. And just to get his thoughts in regards to the important role that the standing committee could play if we were to allow it to advance.
Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, thank you again to the member from Winnipeg for his question. I do agree. Getting it to standing committee is going to be a good thing because those voices who felt they've been left out of the government processes and lead up to this bill and to this point are going to have their opportunity to be heard on this bill. So it is very important that we get there. But I also want to, again, acknowledge the inconsistencies when it comes to engaging those voices, consultations from the Liberal government. Again, on S2, they're going through a multi-year engagement. But on things like this, we hear from communities that there has been no level of engagement and consultation. And the only room left for them is on the things like such a standing committee.
The questions and comments. There, member from Langley Township, Fraser Heights, testing my peripheral vision, but I'll give him a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I want to thank my colleague from Edmonton Northwest for a very enlightening speech on the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Agreement. Thank you for educating us on the importance of this treaty. He talked quite a bit about the ambiguity in the treaty and how that ambiguity might lead to confusion as between various Métis groups. And I'm wondering what comfort the Métis Nation of British Columbia, and yes, there is one, that have jurisdiction over 30,000 plus Métis people. What assurances there are that this will not impact on the very important work that they are doing in my home province?
Well, member for Edmonton Northwest.
Colleague for his question, and there is language in here that attempts to create up safeguards amongst jurisdiction. As mentioned in my speech, there is language reflective in this treaty that acknowledges there are other distinct collectivities and groups. But I also fear that, given some of the precedent has been set, that I am certainly aware that the Canadian Energy Regulator is doing consultations with the Manitoba Métis Federation, and arguably the jurisdiction of the BC Métis Nation itself. And so those things are ambiguous. Those things are clearly not spelled out. I think that space for that dialogue needs to happen, and those things need to be overcome before taking a serious run at the next steps of this bill.
Comments. Question and commentaire. The honourable member for Smilkameen, South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
I thank my colleague for his speech. We are so lucky in this House to have his expertise. There's a lot of people watching this from across the country that may not quite understand because this bill is very complicated. If he were to choose one thing in this bill that we should be focusing on, that gives him, that it concerns him, could he just mention what that is that needs to change before we would be supportive of this?
Member for Edmonton Northwest, an equally brief response.
In the current 2026, the date as of today, I see a real concern when it comes to property rights and that bigger picture when it comes to reconciliation. And so I would like to see some consideration of the Canadian Métis relationship, every other Canadian considered in this, and a protection of property rights, quite frankly.
Debate. Reprise débat. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be sharing my time with the member from Winnipeg Centre. You know, I want to pick up on a couple of points that my colleague and friend from the Conservatives has raised, because I do believe that we are at a very significant moment in time. At the end of the day, when you take a look at C-21, and just yesterday, we were talking about modern treaties. We are talking about how important it is that we advance modern treaties. And here we have before us a modern treaty that will go a long way in dealing with an issue that has been outstanding for generations. And when the member raises the issue of consultations, you know, I've been a parliamentarian both here in Ottawa and in the province of Manitoba for well over 3 decades. Close to 4 decades now. And I can tell you firsthand the discussions, the consultations, the amount of effort, the passion, the tears that have gone into trying to get the recognition. I remember during the early 90s when it was finally recognized in terms of Louis Riel and the founding, as a founding father in the province of Manitoba. In my question, I pose that, you know, Louis Riel just 2 years ago was recognized as Manitoba's first premier. The impact of the Métis people, the province of Manitoba, is what it is today, in good part because of the Métis people. And recognizing it. We don't have to have an absolute perfect thing that passes today. We have the opportunity by allowing the legislation to pass. And through consultations, you know, I can assure you, whether it's the President, any member of the Cabinet that has put in so much effort into what we have here before us today, if there was an interest in trying to find, well, what about this, what about that, try to look, in fact, if there can be amendments that will make it even a healthier, stronger treaty, I can assure you that there is open minds to it. I think that the worst thing that we can do is draw a conclusion and say, well, you know what, it's not perfect, and we'll just have to wait and see. Because I've seen that happen in the past. And that could really cause problems for legislation. And I don't want to see that with this particular piece of legislation. I think that we can, you know, I heard concerns about other Métis nations across the country. The Red River Métis Nation is from my perspective, has done its homework. Come to the province of Manitoba. Take a look at downtown Winnipeg. Take a look in terms of child and family services, childcare, housing, education. It is there in a very real way for the people of the Red River Nation and beyond. You know, I was at a childcare opening where they had actually individuals from our Ukrainian settlement community that were contributing. The Métis Nation in Manitoba recognizes it's a better Canada if we have a strong and healthy Métis Nation. And all one needs to do is drive around in the city of Winnipeg, and you will witness it firsthand. Let alone to take a look at the many different communities throughout the province. It is one of the great prides, and it is a growing pride within our community. I see the legislation as a wonderful example in terms of a modern treaty that could potentially be emulated by other First Nations and Métis. It has great potential, at the very least, for Métis. And I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that we have to look at the very uniqueness of Indigenous people and make adjustments, because you can't make one fit all. But at the very least, recognize the true value in terms of what it is that we're talking about today with this particular treaty, C-21. And because, as I've pointed out, if you want to get that real sense of some of the things that have gone exceptionally well in the city of Winnipeg, it's there, it's tangible. You know, I think, and I made reference to this earlier, in terms of when I think of the Red River Nation, Mr. Speaker, I do think of Louis Riel. You know, he was a member of Parliament, and I don't believe he was ever allowed to take his seat in Parliament. He has been an inspiration for Métis and non-Métis alike. And, you know, when I think in terms of, you know, the Prime Minister last, I believe mid-November, November 16, I believe it is, and I could be wrong on that, Mr. Speaker, but the issue was that we had the Prime Minister of Canada visit the gravesite of Louis Riel with the Métis Federation. And it was a very memorable moment, because when you think in terms of what Louis Riel had to go through to try to get a seat in Parliament, even though he was voted for that seat, Mr. Speaker, to be able to sit in Parliament, to actually have a sitting Prime Minister go to the gravesite, Mr. Speaker. I think that whether it's things of that nature or that recognition from the province, the hanging of a portrait, or as Manitoba's first premier, or just recognizing the many different aspects that are there today that are tangible, where it's reforming and changing lives. I believe it was Starlight Childcare on Selkirk Avenue. It's one of the child care facilities, Mr. Speaker. You have to excuse me for not necessarily knowing the full name. But I was talking about getting some federal dollars. And they were having a difficult time. But it was when the president made contact with Jerry that was ultimately virtually resolved overnight. And you will actually see, Mr. Speaker, that there are children that are being provided first-class care as a result of MMF's direct involvement, working with the federal government and no doubt the provincial government. And I would suggest to you that there are endless examples of what I just finished citing. And that's why when I take a look at the legislation, and I am very familiar with the process, Mr. Speaker, as you would well know, we have an opportunity to see this potentially go to committee as early as next week. That could happen. If the sense of cooperation, it doesn't mean that you have to support the legislation. You can wait see it into the committee stage, at the standing committee, and if you have ideas that you believe that can improve the legislation, by all means, make those suggestions. If you feel there wasn't enough consultations that were done, let's get them as, invite, standing committee gets to invite guests to be able to come and address the standing committee, ask them the questions, get the presentations. It would be a very significant accomplishment to be able to actually have the legislation passed before the end of the month. And I realize it's a tall order, but it would be a nice thing to see. At the very least, what we can do, Mr. Speaker, is we can ensure that it gets to a standing committee where we can get representatives outside of the chamber here to be able to provide their thoughts on what I believe is something that's necessary, a treaty with the Red River Nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to as always thank my colleague from Winnipeg North for his speech. He mentions he's been doing this for about 4 decades. From this side of the House, it feels like it's been 8 decades of him speaking. But to get back to the issue at hand, they seem to want to push along this idea that nothing should be debated in this House. Everything should go right to committee, and they're pushing this again, asking us to let debate collapse. Now, I understand the sentiment of this bill, but we have seen several. We've seen like the Métis of Ontario, the Dakota, the Treaty 5 Nations from Edmonton itself, the OT Pim Sewak Métis Nations have lots of issues with this bill. Does a member from Winnipeg North not believe that their voices should be heard from their representatives in this House, or only the Liberal way of pushing right to committee without their voices being heard?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the member brings up a valid point in terms of making sure that there's voices on all sides on the issue being heard. The point that I'm getting at is that, look, we're all very familiar with the finite amount of time that takes place here on the floor of the House of Commons. And allowing the bill to go to committee, you'll have a great deal of more time in which members are able to express themselves. Those individuals that the members referenced would be able to come before a committee potentially. And there's all sorts of opportunities to be able to provide feedback. And there's still a report stage and a third reading. And so it's not like you're surrendering a great deal in order to be able to allow legislation in order to go to committee. I'm not saying that you have to pass the third reading.
The member, in order to continue with questions and comments, questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Joliette-Manawan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le collègue pour son discours. J'aimerais revenir à une question historique et les impacts sur la population métisse, selon lui, sur le Manitoba aujourd'hui. L'acte constitutionnel de 1871 crée la province du Manitoba, mais sur un tout petit territoire, puis en la privant de juridiction sur ses ressources naturelles, contrairement à la Colombie-Britannique puis à l'île du Prince-Édouard, rattachée à la Confédération à même époque. Après ça, il va y avoir une dispute frontalière entre le Manitoba et l'Ontario pour la forêt. Le Conseil privé de Londres va donner raison, va donner un important territoire forestier à l'Ontario, puis finalement, ils vont dire, le même comité va dire plus tard que c'est l'Ontario puis pas Ottawa qui a les droits sur ses ressources naturelles. Qu'est-ce que ça a amené, ça, comme préoccupation auprès de la nation métisse et de la population du Manitoba jusqu'à aujourd'hui? Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think there's many individuals, possibly even in the House, that would be better equipped to be able to answer that specific question. I was quite impressed with the amount of knowledge the member actually had on the issue in his speech, and I compliment him on that. I think that, for me, what it is just recognizing the value of the legislation that we have before us as a modern treaty. And advancing something that should have been advanced many, many, many years ago.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Secretary of State for Rural Development.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. And I would like to say to my colleague how I appreciated his comments regarding the modern-day treaty that's been 150 years in the making. I especially appreciated hearing him describe how it's shaped the city of Winnipeg, the province of Manitoba. And so I would like to hear him speak on the general sentiment in the population, just general population in the city of Winnipeg and the province of Manitoba regarding this modern-day treaty. If he could expand on that. Thank you.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Government House Leader.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. I genuinely appreciate the question. Why a modern treaty, from my perspective, from my personal perspective, is so important is because I love my city, my province, and my country. In order for us to be able to move and get the potential that we have, Mr. Speaker, we need to get modern treaties in place. If all you need to do is take a look at the footprint and a lot of the growth, a lot of the positive things that are happening in the communities today, it's being rooted back into the MMF. So if we're ever going to hit our potential, these modern treaties are absolutely critical.
Resuming debate, reprise the débat, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I first want to start out by congratulating President Chartrand and the Manitoba Métis Federation for all of their efforts and the Métis community of Manitoba. I rise today to speak to Bill C-21, an act to give effect to the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty. At its core, the bill is about something fundamental. It's about whether we in this House are prepared to respect what should have never been denied in the first place, the inherent right of Indigenous peoples to govern themselves. For generations, Indigenous peoples in this country have fought for recognition, for dignity, and for the ability to make decisions about our own communities, our own laws, and our own futures. These are not demands. These are rights protected by the Constitution. Rights that are recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, rights that are inherent and do not come from the Crown. Bill C-21 seeks to give legal force to the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty. It recognizes the Manitoba Métis Federation as the government of the Red River Métis and affirms their authority to govern their own internal matters, to determine their citizenship, and to structure their leadership in a way that reflects their customs, traditions, and priorities. This is significant. It builds on decades of advocacy, resilience, and leadership by Métis people. It's part of a longer journey towards justice, towards recognition, and towards the restoration of self-determination. And let me be clear, the NDP supports this journey. We support this bill at second reading because we believe in the right to self-determination and Indigenous peoples' ability to define our own futures. We believe that modern treaties, when done right, can be powerful tools to affirm rights, to clarify jurisdiction, and to strengthen Indigenous governance. But support does not mean silence or ignoring concerns. Support does not mean we abandon our responsibility to ensure the rights of all Indigenous peoples are upheld. Because alongside that promise of the bill, there are also serious questions that must be addressed. We have heard concerns from First Nations, including many First Nations in Manitoba, about how this treaty may impact their rights. Concerns about land, about resources, about hunting, fishing, and harvesting. Concerns that decisions made here could affect relationships, responsibilities that have existed long before Parliament. These concerns cannot be dismissed or rushed. They must be heard. That's why I support my colleague's assertion, my honourable colleague from Winnipeg North, to get this to the Standing Committee for further study. That is why we're proposing an amendment to the bill as well, to ensure that nothing can be construed as denying the rights of other Indigenous people, nor abrogating or derogating from them. This proposed amendment is justified by Article 95 of the treaty, which would force Indigenous peoples who believe their rights are adversely affected by the treaty to have to, in quotes, exhaust all appeals before the conflict can be addressed. Is the goal of the government to hold up Indigenous peoples in the courts all the way to the Supreme Court? If we are truly, Mr. Speaker, committed to reconciliation, then we must be equally committed to doing this work properly. This means listening. That means engaging in good faith. That means ensuring that one nation's recognition does not come at the expense of another's rights. Reconciliation is not a checkbox. It's not a slogan. It's a process rooted in respect, accountability, and truth. And truth requires us to acknowledge sometimes things that are uncomfortable. This government has far too often, in fact, failed to uphold Indigenous rights when it matters most. We have seen legislations put forward without the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. We have seen decisions made that undermine sovereignty rather than strengthen it. We have seen promises of partnership followed by actions that erode trust. So when the government tells Indigenous peoples to trust them on this bill, it is not an abstract question. It is grounded in lived experience. Trust is not given, Mr. Speaker. It is earned. And it must be earned again and again through action. That is why the committee study will be crucial. We must hear directly from Indigenous people, from Métis citizens, from First Nations, and those who support this treaty, but also those who have concerns. We must create space for those voices to shape this legislation, to identify risk, and to propose solutions. Because getting this right matters. Getting this right will impact relationships, either positively or negatively. It matters not just for the Red River Métis, but for the broader framework of Indigenous rights in this country. It matters for how treaties are understood, how jurisdictions are respected, and how relationships between Indigenous nations are upheld. We cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of the past, where decisions were imposed rather than co-developed, where rights were ignored rather than respected. We have an opportunity here to do better, to move forward in a way that honors the inherent right and self-government, to strengthen legal recognition of Métis governance, and to ensure that the rights of all Indigenous peoples are upheld, not just in principle, but in practice. So yes, we will support this bill at second reading. We will support it because we believe in self-determination. In fact, we believe in the right of self-determination of all peoples. We will support it because we recognize the long-standing struggle of the Red River Métis for recognition, but we also have to do our job as legislators. We have to ask hard questions, and we will listen carefully. We will work to ensure this legislation reflects the voices of those it impacts. Because reconciliation demands more than words, Mr. Speaker. It demands that we act with integrity and humility and honesty. And it demands that we act with a clear commitment to justice. Mr. Speaker, the path forward must be guided by one principle above all else: that the rights, dignity, and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples are not negotiable. Let us move forward with that understanding. Let us do the work properly, and let us ensure when we pass legislation like Bill 21, we are not only recognizing rights, but truly upholding them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to recognize, and I appreciate the NDP's position in validating the need to actually allow the legislation to get to committee. I think that's a very strong, encouraging and positive word, and it's not to preclude that everything in the legislation is iron solid, but look forward to seeing the amendments, and I would encourage the member to speak within the department, maybe do some other consultations in advance so that we get as much notice as possible in regards to her thoughts. And it's more of a comment than a question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for Winnipeg North for his comments. No legislation ever goes to committee without critique. Committees are an important place to make sure that we get things right, to get other opinions, to get expert testimony, to make sure that when it's actually signed off on, when it passes royal assent, that we don't end up in the courts. We need to make sure this is ironclad. This is a big deal for Winnipeg. Like the honourable member mentioned, the Manitoba Métis Federation, as many other Indigenous peoples in Winnipeg, are building our city. We need to make sure that goes forward smoothly without a hitch. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member opposite for her wonderful speech. I am proud to rise in this House on behalf of the people of London Fanshawe. There is a small Indigenous population that lives in London Fanshawe. Regarding Bill C-21, there are jurisdiction concerns that the treaty lacks clear geographical limits. May the member opposite please explain how this will affect other First Nations throughout Canada. Thank you.
Winnipeg Centre.
Well, thank you so much to my honourable colleague. I think it's really clear. No legislation going forward, certainly this treaty, certainly the implementation bill, is without issue. All bills have amendments when they go to committee, and saying this will give us an opportunity to provide that clarity that's needed to help other nations or even other Métis nations that are having difficulties with the bill to have more assurity. Thank you.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Shefford.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie ma collègue de Winnipeg Centre avec qui j'ai eu l'occasion de siéger, notamment au comité permanent de la condition féminine. Dans son discours, elle parlait que certaines communautés avaient des préoccupations, notamment sur l'exploitation des ressources. Donc, elle semble nommer qu'il y aurait encore des besoins d'écouter et qu'il y aurait encore des inquiétudes. Et je pense aussi que l'on parle souvent, au comité de la condition féminine, on parlait souvent que les femmes autochtones, femmes métisses et autres étaient touchées d'une façon disproportionnée par tellement d'enjeux. Monsieur le Président, ma question à ma collègue, comment ce projet de loi va vraiment aider les femmes autochtones métisses et qu'est-ce que justement elle pourrait proposer pour véritablement s'assurer que leurs droits soient respectés? Merci.
Bravo. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Well, thank you, and it was such a pleasure working with my honourable colleague in the Status of Women Committee. I certainly miss being on that committee. And I would just have to say, I mean, part of the reason why this is so important, part of the reason why modern treaties, when they're done right, are so important, is that nations are able to determine how they wish to deal with those matters, and that includes the safety of their members. That includes, women that within their nation. Let's not forget, prior to colonization, we didn't have a crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and diverse gendered folks. That happened since colonization. Our communities were healthy. Asserting our sovereignty, asserting our self-determination is a way to support healthy communities and healthy families.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Calgary Signal Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a privilege to rise in the House and speak on behalf of the citizens and residents of Calgary Signal Hill. I rise today to speak to Bill C-21, legislation that seeks to give effect to the Red River Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Treaty. Let me be clear at the outset. Conservatives support reconciliation. We support the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, including Métis, First Nations, and Inuit communities, to self-government. We support the recognition of those rights in a manner that is respectful, inclusive, and grounded in law. But supporting reconciliation does not mean abandoning responsibility. It does not mean rushing forward with flawed legislation. And it certainly does not mean ignoring the voices of those Indigenous communities who are raising serious and legitimate concerns. That is precisely what is happening with Bill C-21. This bill asks Parliament to ratify a treaty of enormous consequence, one that establishes for the first time a Métis self-government agreement of this scale. It recognizes the Manitoba Métis Federation as the exclusive representative of the Red River Métis and grants it lawmaking authority over matters such as citizenship, governance, and internal administration. On its face, that may sound like progress, but when we examine the details, serious problems emerge, problems that cannot and must not be ignored. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, there's been a clear and undeniable failure to consult. This treaty does not exist in a vacuum. It has implications far beyond Manitoba. The language contained within it, particularly in the preamble and key provisions, extends its potential reach across Western Canada and even beyond. We see this in provisions that explicitly state that the geographic scope of the Red River Métis is not defined. We see it in language that acknowledges that Red River Métis citizens may be located, to quote, within what is now Manitoba as well as elsewhere inside and outside of Canada, end quote. And we see it in provisions that prevent any other Indigenous organization from representing individuals who may be considered Red River Métis. Taken together, these clauses create ambiguity that has real-world consequences. And what has been the response from other Métis governments? They are sounding the alarm. The Métis Nation of Ontario has warned that this treaty uses deliberate ambiguities to justify intervention in matters far outside Manitoba. They point to instances where the Manitoba Métis Federation has already sought consultation on projects in British Columbia, thousands of kilometers from the Red River. The Métis Nation Saskatchewan has expressed concern that the treaty could allow the Manitoba Métis Federation to supersede its authority within Saskatchewan. The Métis Nation of Alberta has gone even further, alleging that the agreement could enable the Manitoba Federation to actively recruit members within Alberta, undermining existing Métis governance structures. These are not minor disagreements. These are fundamental disputes over identity, jurisdiction, rights. And yet the government is asking us to proceed as though these concerns do not exist. Mr. Speaker, reconciliation cannot be built on division. If multiple Métis governments across this country are telling us that they were not properly consulted, that their rights may be impacted, and that this treaty risks overriding their authority, then we have a duty to listen. We also have a legal duty. Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 recognizes and affirms the rights of Indigenous peoples. The Supreme Court of Canada has made it clear that these rights are held by distinct communities, not by a single centralized entity claiming to speak for all. In the Powley decision of that court, the court emphasized that Métis communities are diverse, with distinct histories and traditions across different regions. That principle is essential. Yet this treaty risks collapsing that diversity into a single narrative, one that elevates the Red River Métis as the defining authority, potentially at the expense of other legitimate Métis communities. That is not reconciliation. That is exclusion. Mr. Speaker, the concerns are not limited to Métis groups alone. First Nations have also raised serious objections. The Dakota TP and the Kanupak Wakpa Dakota First Nations have gone to court arguing that they were not consulted and that the treaty infringes upon their rights. They have made it clear that they never ceded their ancestral lands and that any agreement affecting those lands must involve them. The Treaty 5 nations have expressed serious concerns about the inclusion of the Manitoba Métis Federation in decision-making processes within their territory, calling it a direct affront to their sovereignty. These are not abstract concerns. These are constitutional issues, issues that go to the heart of the Crown's duty to consult and to accommodate. And if those duties have not been met, this treaty is vulnerable to legal challenge. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it's not a question of whether there will be litigation. It is a question of how much. We've already seen similar agreements challenged in court. The federal court's decision in Métis Settlements General Counsel versus Canada raised concerns about overly expansive recognition that limits the Crown's ability to negotiate with other Indigenous groups. Bill C-21 appears to repeat those same mistakes by granting exclusive recognition to the Manitoba Métis Federation and embedding that recognition within a constitutionally protected treaty. The government is effectively locking in a framework that may disadvantage other Métis communities, and doing so in a way that cannot easily be undone or even corrected. Once ratified, this treaty will have constitutional status under sections 25 and 35. That means it cannot be unilaterally amended or revoked. Any flaws, any oversights, any failures in consultation will be frozen in place. That is not careful governance. That is recklessness. Mr. Speaker, there are also serious concerns about the scope of authority being granted under this treaty. The Manitoba Métis Federation would be empowered to create laws, establish institutions, and even impose sanctions, including fines and imprisonment for violations of those laws. While there are provisions that attempt to reconcile conflicts with federal law, the reality is that this creates a complex and potentially conflicting legal landscape. Even more concerning is the implication that these laws could apply beyond Manitoba, given the treaty's refusal to define geographic boundaries and its recognition of citizens located across Canada. This raises fundamental questions about jurisdiction, enforcement, and the rule of law. Can a government created under this treaty exercise authority over individuals in another province? How will conflicts between provincial laws and Métis laws be resolved? What mechanisms will ensure accountability and consistency? These questions remain unanswered. Mr. Speaker, there are also fiscal implications that deserve scrutiny. The treaty commits Canada to ensuring that the Manitoba Métis Federation has the financial capacity to meet its expenditure needs. It contemplates ongoing transfer payments and future agreements on taxation. Yet we have little clarity on the long-term costs, the accountability mechanisms, or the impact on other Indigenous communities seeking similar arrangements. At a time when Canadians are already facing economic uncertainty and headwinds, Parliament has a responsibility to ensure that any new fiscal commitments are transparent, sustainable, and fair. That has not been demonstrated here. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to address a broader concern and one that goes to the legitimacy of this agreement. The Manitoba Métis Federation is incorporated as a legal entity, MMF Inc. While that may be appropriate for administrative purposes, it raises important questions about the nature of this treaty. A treaty in the constitutional sense is meant to be a nation-to-nation agreement. It reflects a relationship between distinct peoples, not between the Crown and a corporate body. By structuring this agreement through an incorporated entity, the government risks blurring that distinction and undermining the very principles it claims to uphold. Mr. Speaker, none of this is to deny the importance of recognizing Métis self-government. That is a goal we all share in this House. But recognition must be implemented effectively. It must be inclusive. It must be legally sound. It must reflect the rights and voices of all affected communities. Bill C-21 is currently drafted, fails on all three counts. It excludes key stakeholders, it introduces legal ambiguity, and it risks deepening divisions within and between Indigenous communities. That is why Conservatives cannot support this bill in its current form. We are calling on the government to do the responsible thing, to pause, to listen, and to engage in meaningful consultation with all affected parties. Let us bring this bill to committee. Let us hear from Métis governments across the country, from First Nations leaders, from legal experts, and from those whose rights may be impacted. Let us do the hard work of getting this right, because reconciliation is not achieved through shortcuts. It is built through trust, through dialogue, and through respect. Mr. Speaker, Canadians expect us to uphold these principles. Indigenous communities deserve nothing less. For those reasons, I urge all members of this House to oppose Bill C-21 in its current form. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the member did say, well, let's get it to committee. That's one encouraging remark that I heard in regards to the member's comments. You know, the issue of membership comes up. And I think of someone of a very proud Red River Métis nation of his or her heritage, and in fact their core identity. And in order to identify yourself as that, as a proud man or woman, that you do not have to actually live in the city of Winnipeg or rural Manitoba. There are individuals that do live outside, but want that citizenship with the MMF. And I think that, and the reason why I say that is that if you have issues surrounding things of that nature, that the best place for us to be able to deal with them is to actually deal with it at that committee level. And the member said that he'd be open to seeing it going to committee. And that's why I say that aspect is encouraging. We're not saying that it has to pass second reading unanimously. What we're suggesting is that we allow it to get to committee, Mr. Speaker, so that we can hear that feedback, we can get the answers. And wonder if he could provide his thoughts on the advantages of getting it to a standing committee sooner as opposed to later.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Signal Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend across the aisle for his comments. Fundamentally, of course, our committee process in this House is to do that, to take the opportunity to hear from individuals who can provide experience, expertise, and knowledge. And the process is intended, of course, to refine and to improve legislation. Certainly, I think that's a requirement in this case. I express only my disappointment that the initial bill as presented to the House hasn't incorporated more of that consideration, more of those voices. When we in the opposition can locate those parties who've expressed these things as they say to us, to the government, yet they're not reflected in legislation, it just moves the starting point that much further back. So can we see this improved in committee as we support the general goal? Yes, there's a lot of work to be done there, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to this House accomplishing its objectives.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de la Pointe-de-l'Île.
Merci, félicitations à mon collègue pour son discours. Effectivement, bon, ce qu'il dit, de ce que j'en ai compris, c'est qu'il n'y a pas eu assez de consultations. Il faut vraiment permettre que l'entente n'enlève pas des droits à d'autres collectivités métisses ou d'autres Premières Nations. Est-ce qu'il ne pense pas qu'il y aurait moyen d'amender le projet de façon à ce que ça laisse place à d'autres futures ententes qui pourraient, de façon à respecter les droits de l'ensemble des collectivités métisses? Merci.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Signal Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. It certainly does appear that there are voices who state they have not been consulted. So whatever exact process was undertaken, it appears to have come up short at this point in time. So to the extent that additional voices need to be heard, it is on the proponents of this bill to determine the best way to do that, to bring that information to the House, to satisfy this House that those parties have been duly and appropriately consulted, not just against legal obligations, but against moral and the obligations of sound judgment that this House must bring in bringing legislation to our country as a whole. And when a group like the Manitoba Métis Federation is to enter into an historic agreement with the Government of Canada with far-reaching implications, important implications, we have to get it right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Similar Community South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Thank you, and I thank my colleague for his speech. It's very concerning when a bill like this comes forward and there is so much dissent against it, and yet the government representatives, MPs are wondering why we're bringing forward the concerns, and that's why we're here. Definitely. Again, there have been First Nations and Métis governments raising concerns, including Dakota Nations, arguing that failure to consult violates constitutional duties. Treaty 5 nations object, and some First Nations say that the MMF participation in governments oversteps jurisdiction. I could keep reading the list, but basically I want to ask again of my fellow MP, what needs to change besides basically, I mean, it seems like a lot needs to change, and what should we be worrying about when there's so much dissent against this bill?
Honourable Member for Calgary Signal Hill.
I thank my colleague for the question. Undoubtedly, the issue of consultation is extremely important. Again, the greater the magnitude of the legislation, its impacts, the changes it will affect, I think that is obvious to anyone who would give it some consideration, that the greater the necessity for broad consultation. Clearly, consultation cannot be selective. It is not a process of calling those who may support your position, those with whom you are friendly, and seeking only that input. Consultation needs to be broad, and it needs to consider the various parties who are affected by the legislation that is proposed. As I said earlier, when we in the opposition have been able to identify groups who have spoken out in opposition to this legislation on the basis of a failure to effectively consult, it's difficult for us to understand how the government could be satisfied with the work that it's done to bring this legislation forward. It would seem obvious to me that when groups speak out to say, we haven't been consulted on this, the obvious answer would be to consult with them, to hear what their perspectives are, to understand why they feel they will be impacted, and then to undertake the duty to consult.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Joliette-Manawan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Un ami me fait remarquer qu'il me dit qu'il n'y a pas de disposition de sauvegarde des droits constitutionnels des autres peuples qui peuvent être compromis dans C-21. Qu'en pense l'honorable collègue? Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Honourable Member for Calgary Signal Hill.
Well, that's definitely a question of concern, Mr. Speaker. It's one of the problems with the legislation in its current form, and that is simply that the extent of the impacts the legislation will have are not completely understood. As I mentioned, once this is enshrined as a treaty, a Government of Canada treaty, that any kind of changes or adjustments are extremely difficult and not possible to make. And thus we've got to understand. Now that's not always easy to look into the future. And if anybody here in the House today has a good crystal ball, I'd be happy to borrow it from time to time. But legal scholars, those in government, those with expertise in certain areas, are entrusted with this task all the time. It would be the purpose at committee of getting information from people who can project what the impact of this legislation would be based on their own experiences, based on their knowledge. And we need to draw on that. It's our view as a Conservative Party that that task was not undertaken fully and completely, and that we are left with a bill that is not fully ready for passage before the House. So to return to some of those processes to improve the legislation is our goal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.